before I start, okay, got it. Yeah, thank you. Before I start the actual formal lecture, first of all, sorry, thank you so much for inviting me for this talk, and thank you everybody for coming along. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about this with you all. And I hope you enjoyed your breakout rooms. I was in a wonderful room, just three of us, and I thought, wow, there's no point in my talk after we'd had our session. So it looks like you're all very savvy on what we should see in this sort of field. Somebody asked if I would give just a little bit of background about myself, if that's okay, in the context of giving this talk. So it might seem strange because, you know, I'm a geologist. That's my technical area. And you might think, what on earth is a geologist doing talking about this? But, you know, a geologist wanders around the world a lot. And actually, traditionally, geologists have been involved in a lot of areas of national development, you know, from finding resources, finding water, helping with infrastructure, helping with environment things. And these days, a lot more emphasis on things like climate change, sustainable development goals, and things like that. So I actually started, I'm from UK, and I started internationally working professionally with my PhD actually. My first ever flight was to North Pakistan, would you believe? And it was like, for me, it was like landing on Mars, and it really opened my eyes, changed my life in many ways. And from then on, I have been involved in a lot of international development projects. Even working, I've been very lucky to work with prime ministers, ministers, key decision makers in the aid donors, working with governments, government agencies, with industry, all the players that are involved in this. I've been very lucky to be able to work with these people, and of course down to community and village level too. So yeah, that's my background. In terms of places I've worked, I've largely worked in places like the Pacific Islands region, in South Asia, and in the Caribbean, bit of South America. I haven't worked an awful lot in Africa, but I've done a little bit in Africa. So today, anyway, I'm going to talk about power asymmetries in international development. And of course, that also means aid. So international development, aid, they're not synonymous, but there's a big overlap. I'm going to talk about what is international development. I'm going to give a little bit of historical and global context. I'm going to give one practical example, and I'm trying to draw out lessons from that alongside a deeper analysis. This is from Afghanistan, which is probably the most challenging aid project I ever worked on. And then a few conclusions, although that's probably the wrong word, thinking towards conclusions. I think in this field there never are conclusions. My caveat is I'm not really here as a researcher. This is me working as a practitioner. I've not been, you know, in a situation in a university or ever where this has been my international aid per se, has been my focus of development. So but then again, I also think practitioners, like in many parts, many subjects in the world, they actually have the more mature view in many ways. Academics are very useful for reviewing the big pictures, for coming up with good ideas, for helping with policy, and for thought leadership. But it's a struggle for, and we can talk about that after the talk if you like. Unfortunately, sorry, I haven't got time to explore that angle. It was in my paper, but I just think there's a mismatch in the reward system between people who want a good career in academics or research institutes and actually doing something like international development. But we can talk about that. That's just my take on it. Okay. Well, yes, I think you all articulated this probably in your groups, your breakout groups. This is one view of aid, that actually it is not aid. It is just an expansion of colonial power, of Northern Hemisphere power, of using money to further selfish interests, or an extension of soft power. It doesn't do very much. The money never gets to where it should get to. And I quite like that one at the top, is that foreign aid is when you take the money from the poor people in your own rich country and give it to the rich people in a poor country. And yes, you know, there's elements of truth in all these cartoons and this point of view. And if this was true, why would we bother? Why would we bother with aid, you might ask? Being a little bit more generous, and you might not want to be, but I'm trying my best to be a little bit more generous. Here's my attempt at defining aid international development. And this is activities aimed at reducing levels of inequality and variable opportunity between the economically richer and poorer nations of the world. That's what I'd like to think it's about, that it's about rebalancing. And then the second part of this is it usually involves a two-way and probably a many-way sharing or transfer of knowledge, technology, skills, and experience between, you know, to put it crudely, the donor country and the recipient country and all the people involved. And shorthand for this is that for me, a big measure of success is if you do yourself out of a job. If me, for example, if myself coming from a richer country who is lucky enough to work in this area in a less rich country, if I can do myself out of a job in a reasonable period of time, for me, that's success, because you're not needed anymore. And that's what we'd like to see in all of this. I want to throw in another area, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals. Before them, the Millennial Goals. Before then, the thinking from the late 1980s in various UN level meetings about what aid is all about and what development is all about. I think the mature thinking started from there. Before then, it was a different ballgame, which I'll be going through a little bit. One thing you have to learn when you're involved in this, particularly if you haven't come in as a development person, but you find yourself thrown in the deep water with development people all talking their own language, is you've got to pick up the language. And it really is another language. And I'm just putting up here a list of terms of the way development-oriented people talk about different countries in the world. And there's of course, there's terms like developed nation, underdeveloped nation, third world, first world, high income, low income, and a whole small island development states, landlocked developing states, all this sort of stuff. That gets juxtaposed with different worldviews. And as time goes by, a lot of people get offended by these phrases. They think, well, this reflects a worldview. This reflects the Northern Hemisphere looking at the Southern Hemisphere and deciding to categorize them and using these terms. So whether you like these terms or not, they're still around. Nearly all of these terms are still around. And then there's a big argument about rebalancing the term, finding the right politically correct, least offensive term, and it's a minefield. And these things matter, actually. I'll just give you one example. If you, with the World Bank, they look at something called the International Development Assistance Country, or IDAC. They have their own way of classifying the world. If you're in one category, you get given money. If you're in the next category up, which you might like to be, because it's in one level, that means that you're a bit richer, a bit more developed. If that's again, these are all value-laden terms. It means that you get loaned the money. Not as good, eh? Although World Bank loans actually these days are not on pretty good terms. And then we divide the world, of course. These terms end up dividing the world on a map. Here's the Human Development Index, which is probably one of the most sophisticated ways of looking at the world. Essentially here, if you're in red, you are entitled to aid from the richer countries. China, I'll talk about differently. China, and not only China, but other parts of the world. India, for example, look at this differently. But who categorizes? What criteria are used? What is the dominant worldview in all of this? Whatever international development is, whether you love it or hate it or whatever, one thing it is big business and it's global. So you can see on the figures on the left there, currently aid is at about 160 billion a year. And that's equivalent to a GDP of about the 60th country in the world on the world scale of GDP's gross domestic product. A little bit of that is the COVID kick, which probably isn't really aid at all. So the best figures, I think, are around about 2014, when there was quite a lot of work done on this. And they reckon the global business was worth between 130 and 140 billion. You can see on the right there a list of countries who are the so-called donors. You can see USA at the top there, and then the other sorts of countries. And again, you know, statistics and damn statistics and all of this, you can do a lot of these things. It looks like USA is very generous. Well, they're not. Yeah, they only give 0.2% of their gross domestic product, or whatever the economy, to aid, which is one of the lowest of the OECD countries. Actually, it's just because their economy is so big, they give the most. Also, the USA still practice quite a lot of old-fashioned aid. A lot of their aid is very much tied to political agendas, including military aid, including increasing their geopolitical power around the world, and also much American aid is reinvested in America and American things. Europe, I would argue, Europe are much more mature in the aid market. You probably know that 0.7% of the economy of a country, the gross domestic product or similar measures, is what the rich countries are aiming for in giving in international aid. Very few countries get there. So the Nordic countries get there, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, places like that. I was very proud when my country, UK, got there for a while, but unfortunately the current Prime Minister decided that, yeah, we didn't want to do that anymore. And I think it's dropped to about 0.3%. So I've gone from a little bit of pride to a lot of shame because of that decision. It's about givers and receivers, of course, and you can see here, this is a list, just a map anyway. On the bottom, we've got that list again of people who give aid. The map at the top shows where it goes. And you can see it's very much a northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere, with the exceptions Australia, New Zealand, and places like that, who are within the OECD world, as you well know. And again, the deeper colors are the countries that get the most aid assistance. And this too is in some ways a misrepresentation. India, if I take the case of India, for example, it looks like they receive a lot of aid. Well, perhaps they do in terms of absolute dollars, but spreading that around about 1.4 billion people, it's not very high at all. And in fact, India's kicked out most of the national aid providers. They don't want it, and they don't want all the hassles that go with it. So they are very selective about the aid they receive, for example. So there are stories within stories that I probably haven't got too much time to explore in this talk. So this is more about giving the overall global sort of sort of picture. Of course, we have to talk about this. We have to talk about the colonial legacy, which really has set the scene for assistance, aid, and the development paradigms and discussions. These are what UK, Holland, France, Spain, and Portugal. Between them, look at them, between them, my God, there was hardly a bit of the world untouched by 500 years on thereabouts of colonialism. And of course, that was 500 years of taking money from one part of the world and hoovering it up and investing it in your own country, and also setting up the power dynamics in which the world is today, even in post-colonial times. And I do not want to forget about this one. Americans often say, oh, we don't have an empire. We're not like these European people. We've never had an empire. Well, I would argue they've got the biggest empire in the world. And they've been the strongest economic power since 1870. A lot of the time since 1870, they've been worth half of the world's economy. And even now it's 20% of the world's economy or thereabouts. So they're an incredibly powerful player and influencer in anything to do with international development and aid. One of the reasons is Europe loves to keep America happy. They do not like going against what America wants to do. Look at the case of Iran, for example. Iran is starved of investment, as is Cuba. So probably a lot of Europeans would like to give assistance to these countries, but it's very difficult just to do that and stay friends with America. On the other hand, I do have a lot of admiration for what America did just after World War II. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about how aid has changed. So I'm now moving from like the more distant colonial past into the post-colonial to the present. And I'm going to talk about this in two phases, from 1945 to about the 70s, 80s. And it's a little bit like, this is not synchronous in all of the world. The thinking about aid is different in different parts of the world at different times. So you can't say that, in 1975 it all changed from one way of thinking to another. This is an ongoing evolution, and some countries are further ahead than others in the thinking. But I think a lot of it began in the modern era by the Americans, who set up this brilliant network in many ways. Brilliant for them, and actually, I guess you could argue a lot of the world has benefited from this. So what did they do in that post-World War II period? They set up some of the architecture of the world, which we all follow the rules of in many ways. They set up the United Nations. They set up the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization that we've all got a bit tired of listening to in COVID many times, and many other similar agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, and all that. Now, love them or hate them, they have set up a whole bunch of systems, a whole bunch of bodies, and they are channeling a lot of money. And they have been at the forefront of what does development mean, and the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., have come out of these bodies. I also admire the way they really did excellent nation building, at least from an economic point of view, in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. When you contrast, what happened to Germany after World War I, where everybody wanted to punish them, and then eventually they came back and produced World War II. So after World War II, the Americans in particular said, we're not going to make that mistake again. And they put a huge amount of investment in Germany, making all the other victors in Europe pretty jealous, to be honest. But they did a great job in Germany and built a very, very powerful and sustainable country, as they did with the other loser, Japan. And they did the same with South Korea. South Korea had the war, as you know, in the 1950s. It was a very agricultural country at that time. Now it's one of the industrial powerhouses of the world. And then America didn't hang around, not like the Europeans. They didn't stay in country. They left, although, of course, there's a lot of power there, and there's a lot of their military bases and things like that. But they didn't stay to rule the countries or these sorts of things. So, I liked this period of American history, actually. I thought they did some good things here. So empires collapsed. The old way of the rich world controlling the rest of the world wasn't working anymore, wasn't socially acceptable anymore. They had to get out. And so from the 1940s through the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, a whole series of ex-colonial countries became independent one way or another, whatever that independence means. But of course, it was independence within a world system dictated by the Northern Hemisphere. So the Northern Hemisphere didn't want to lose its direct contacts with the Southern Hemisphere, of course, and the other parts of the world. And paradoxically, the colonized didn't seem to want to completely break their connections with the colonizers. And a lot of the aid connections today still have those links. So if you look at Dutch, for example, they still have a lot of links with Indonesia. You look at the French, they've got a lot of links with French Africa. You look at the British, they've got a lot of links with their old territories, and so on and so forth. The early part of aid, I would describe just in simple terms as highly paternalistic, highly one-sided, very power asymmetrical, and usually focusing on things like big-scale, highly technical projects. So things like building dams, building roads, building railways, power stations, agricultural systems, later on health and education, and things like that. Very strong political agendas too drove this, yeah, so that's how I would describe the earlier phase of aid since 1945. It changed, actually, and I witnessed the change. And if I can use one area I work with, so I know something a little bit about, and I apologize, it's a bit UK-centric, this, but they did sort of lead the way for a brief period of time. And this was in the 80s and 90s when the Department for International Development was formed. And they made a lot of statements by forming the Department for International Development. What they said was, we are not going to be driven by the politics of the UK anymore. Of course, that didn't work entirely, but it was a strong statement. They wanted a divorce away from political agendas. They also said, we don't want to focus on the expert-only sort of stuff. We don't want huge, big teams of the Brits going and telling people what they should be doing, what they want to do, and telling the recipient country what they need. That's all over now. We want more teamwork. We want more we want more decision making, more communal decision making. We want to know more about what the priorities of of the Southern world is, and we want the Southern world to have more of a voice. Of course, still, if you have the money, you have the power, and I don't know how you change that one. But there was a big rebalancing of power. It wasn't just them. I think the European Union also did a wonderful job. And then all of the European countries behind this, the Nordic countries in particular, I would say, in Germany as well. So there was also a move in terms of the subjects they studied. So no longer would they be technology only or technical only. They moved into the areas of governance, for example. Good governance was everything. They didn't want to give the countries which they perceived as having very poor governance because they thought it's a waste of time. The money never gets delivered. It gets lost in corruption, and nothing gets delivered to where we want it to end up with. So they focused on building governance, building institutions, capacity building. It was a lot less paternalistic, although I wouldn't say not paternalistic at all, more collegiate, but the power asymmetry still remained. And then, of course, we have the role of China. Not only China, there are other agencies, Korea, Vietnam, India. They all have their own technical assistance programs, and they have had for a long time. And some countries are both donors and receivers of aid. You could argue even in Europe. I mean, if you go to parts of the poorer parts of the European countries in Spain or Portugal, Ireland or wherever, UK, they receive aid from the European Union as well as being part of the European Union. So, you know, there isn't a simple relationship here. But just from the point of view of this analysis, it helps to simplify it a little bit. Well, Chinese aid is different. And I must admit, I'm amused by the criticisms of Chinese aid because it's exactly what the European and the American countries have done and still do for centuries. But anyway, they have this criticism of them poor things. They say that it's a projection of their national power, a projection of their influence, that is purely on technical things, that actually all the human resources Chinese, which is true largely. If you've seen Chinese aid operating in country, they often bring in armies of their own people because 1.4 billion people, yeah, their agenda is getting their people employed. And they'll do this around the world. And yes, of course, they want to influence people. They are a huge international power now. And I'm sorry, the rest of the world, we've just got to get used to it. And they're going to be doing all sorts of things, flexing their muscles, you know, proportionate to where they've got now in the geopolitical power game. One thing with China, though, however, if you want something done, they get it done quickly. If you want a road built, you want a power station built or something, or a hospital built or anything like that, it's done, and it's done really quickly. What European aid in particular has gone down the road of is ticking lots of boxes. You know, human rights this, women's rights that, LGBT rights here, and every right under the sun is having to be ticked before aid is agreed on. This means that the lead-in times into projects actually happening are long, and the negotiations to get something off the ground from concept to delivery or just groundbreaking, you know, breaking stuff on the ground is long, and the countries get fed up with this. So I'm now going to move a little bit to my own personal bit for a part of the talk, and I worked for a lot of my career with this organization called the British Geological Survey. Now, every country in the world has a geological survey. In New Zealand, we have GNS, which is the Geological and Nuclear Sciences Institute, which is a Crown Institute. These are long-term strategic, meant to be for the national good and the international good. Now, BGS was the very first in the world, formed in 1835, and for much of its history, it had a colonial entity to it. So all of the British Empire countries had a colonial, like the Indian Colonial Survey, for example. They teamed up with the land surveys, and with archaeological surveys and everything else. So a lot of the countries, if you go in today, if you go into Kenya, for example, or India, in many parts of these countries, you'll see that the maps they have still, some of the most recent ones may even be from these colonial times. So I'm not going to talk about that, but the whole institute, except just to give it the historical context. The institute then became a national institute, but it worked internationally, and it's worked in every country in the world pretty much. And the style of the way they deliver aid reflects the global style I was talking about earlier. So in the earlier days, we'd send in large teams. The teams would be residential for 5 years or so. They would be focused on a particular project. They would, of course, always have an element of capacity building. Whether or not that was the bigger part of the project or not depended on by project. And now a lot of the aid is more fly in, fly out. The assistance is fly in, fly out. There's not big teams so much anymore. The BGS employees will be out there in a more of an advisory capacity. The money is more now about how much can you spend in country, how much can you, what value can you add within the country in the project duration that you're working on. And you've also got to do all of the modern stuff. So you've got to tick all the boxes. You've got to think about programs which deliver on governance, which deliver on capacity building, deliver on institutional strengthening, address the sustainable development goals or the national development goals of the country. And the sorts of areas that we'll work in are things like mapping, resources, waste management, environment, a whole lot of things, to be honest. And they're getting wider and wider as the world gets more and more complex. So I'm going to talk to you about one case study that, as I said, probably the most complex thing I've been involved with. And this is in Afghanistan. And as you know, now Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, even today. And it's had a long, difficult history, particularly since 1979, when the Soviets invaded. Now, I'm a big admirer of the Soviets in Afghanistan before that time. I think the Soviets still are the best country for development in Afghanistan. And I think nobody else comes near them. You've probably met people who were the hippies in the 60s and 70s and who visited Afghanistan, and they waxed lyrical about their time there. It was a real joyous time. The Afghans have told me themselves all about these times. And it was largely down to their relationship with the Soviet Union. The roads were good. The cities looked pretty good. There was a lot of technical assistance within Russia. Russian was a strong language spoken within the country. Yeah, I have a lot of admiration for the relationship at that time. Unfortunately, then for various reasons, the Russians decided to invade, and then actually it led down to the breakdown of the Soviet Union 10 years later, and there's been war in Afghanistan ever since. So anyway, how did we get involved? We got involved in, I want to take you back to 2002. Now, and also before then, actually 9/11 and the Taliban Mark I, not the Taliban of today, the earlier Taliban, who took over Afghanistan in the late 90s. So we had 9/11, as you know, the Twin Towers falling down in New York and all of that. That changed the US view on geopolitics. They wanted revenge, and then they thought, well, yeah, after the revenge, then what do we do? So they wanted to get into they blamed the Taliban, rightly or wrongly, for 9/11. They wanted to get in there. There was a military operation, and it was freed up. And then, though, the whole thing was opened up for particularly European and North American aid. And every country from Europe and North America went in. It was like an aid jamboree. And we were part of that. We got visited by a guy I'll tell you about who invited us. When I say we, I'm now got my hat on as a British Geological Survey worker. And we got invited over to Afghanistan to discuss a program with them. Why us? Because we were perceived as being an institute who worked well with people as well as delivering the scientific and technical side. The big sort of concept here was to move from a war and a narcotic economy, which Afghanistan was then and unfortunately still is now, to a more peace-oriented country with a diverse economy, kick-started by natural resources. Afghanistan is very rich in natural resources, but only 1% of the economy is directly earned from natural resources. The other big things were poverty alleviation, job creation, institutional strengthening, and so forth. So there were three of us involved, I guess. One was the BGS that I've told you about. One is the government of Afghanistan, and the other one is UK aid through the Department for International Development. And I'll look at it's wider than this. I'll get into that a bit later on. And the man there called Juma Mohammadi, he came to see us in Nottingham, actually, where our headquarters was in England. and started the negotiations. He was a brilliant man to work with. I really loved working with this man, Juma Mohammadi. He had been Minister of the Water and Engineering Department in the pre-Soviet invasion days in Afghanistan. He then left, as many did, as a refugee. He ended up in America, and he ended up working for the World Bank for a long time. He had a lot of influence in Washington. And like many of the diaspora Afghans, they wanted to go back and share the skills they picked up in the West to help with nation building. And on the right there, you can see me with the advisory team of Juma Mohammadi. And together, we worked intensively on how we can maximize all of the agendas of UK aid, of what they want as a national government. And actually, to be fair to my organization, we weren't that bothered. We didn't really have that many agendas other than, I guess, making a bit of money to keep our salaries going, and also capability development. So our agenda was not so big, but the other two were pretty big. And how do we get the balance between those two going? So it kicked off something like this. The Afghan minister approached 2002. Afghanistan set its priority needs. I was deployed. I went in February 2003, just before the US invaded Iraq, which unfortunately changed the situation in Afghanistan for the worse, but that's another story. We jointly designed the project. The minister and the team, however, and I should have been on this plane too, were killed. Wasn't my time. I'm still here. They are not anymore, I'm afraid. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. That was a big setback, but we thought, my God, we can't stop now. We had a lot of negotiations with the suspicious DFID, who thought, what on earth do scientists and geologists have to do with nation building in a post-conflict country? So we had to go through all of the discussions with them, and then we hit the ground in 2004. The project actually went on almost until the Taliban recently invaded. Yes.
Mike, you have 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Sorry.
Yes. I'll quickly move on.
Then we can have questions. Thank you.
So this is what Afghanistan looked like at that time. You can see post-conflict, lots of buildings like this, people living in these buildings, if you look carefully there. This was the Geological Survey office. Everything that isn't red there is being hit by a bullet or a mortar shell. This is what the inside looked like. There was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no toilets. This too, and there was ordnance all over the place ready to blow you up when you walked in the garden. There was demoralized staff. Who's a director of the Afghan Geological Survey, traumatized, suspicious, Soviet mindsets. These were all the sorts of things we had to attend to or work with. This was the incident that killed the minister and his whole team, which I should have been on that plane too, but for whatever reason I wasn't. That was a major setback. But we got in there and we started doing things, and it was a reasonably successful project by certain measures of the project. So we managed to attract, we didn't have enough money for this, but we managed to attract American and other money and refurbished the building. We introduced computers. There were no computers to be seen in Afghanistan at that time, IT training. We developed things like the information base, developed labs and capability and all of this sort of thing. And these are just some of the pictures of some of the people we were involved with. So just from a power point of view then, what did we look at there? Well, first of all, to get this off the ground and to try and get this to look like a reasonably successful aid or international development project, we have the 3 circles on the left. So one was UK DFID, one was my organization, and one was Afghanistan. There are the different agendas. So one is a funding agency, one wants post-conflict development. They're conscious of geopolitics, they're conscious of relationships with Pakistan, India, and China, the regional development, and also keeping America friendly, okay? The parent body was mainly, we were more worried about health and safety of our staff in a situation like Afghanistan. Could we actually do something like this? Could we successfully deploy? And also keeping our parent body happy that wasn't used to projects like this. And then from Afghanistan, it was a post-conflict situation. How do we re-strengthen our country? It was working across a bunch of ministries, and it was they also wanted to maximize donor inputs, because for once they were the center of attention and there was a lot of money swashing around. Wider considerations, America always in the background here, post 9/11, their geopolitics of Central Asia, their links to the European allies. So, you know, there was always behind the scenes talking that I didn't always see. And then on the Afghan side, traumatized country, many legacies from war, strong ex-Soviet influence, tortured colleagues. Literally, most of the colleagues I work with have been tortured in various wars. And there's also suspicion between the Afghan diaspora and the people who stayed. Extreme poverty, jobs, and this sort of thing. So then moving from that back globally, then there is a huge power asymmetry with the aid. So we could characterize aid as being number one, highly imbalanced relationship. The dollars and the power are on one side. Even the language, donor recipient, is not great, is it? I don't know about you, but if I'm always the one receiving money and you're always the one giving me money, how does that make me feel as a human individual? And of course, that translates to all sorts of relationships. Global development categories are very much Northern world oriented, colonial legacies. Recipient in the past in particular had few decision-making powers. There's an over-reliance on aid in some countries. Solomon Islands, for example, I think is about 90% dependent on aid, and that is not a good position to be in. Application of hard and soft power politics. How can we turn all of this into a healthy relationship? Well, I had to go on a couple of publications at this, and just to summarize, I guess it's basically look beyond your technical skill to the wider picture and context of success. So these diagrams, pictograms, are meant for a technical audience, for in my case, a geoscience audience, engineer type audience or whatever. We are the types of people that end up as technical people working on these sorts of projects. And in the past, they've had a highly technological focus, and some of the technical people, they're great people and all of that, but they might have struggled to see this wider context. And what's happened now is these people are trained to a much higher level in the wider context before they are deployed on the whole. Of course, it doesn't always stick, it doesn't always work, but it's actually changing. So dreaming a little bit towards a power rebalance, what could it look like? Well, I would say the Southern world has got to be on the decision-making teams from the get-go, from the very beginning, and every other decision-making sort of process. Priorities have got to be decided by the countries. Investments that are allocated have got to be spent within the country and not used as a like hidden investment within the rich country or not lost along the way. We've got to use it for maximizing local resources, decouple interventions from political agendas. We should use it to build good governance capacity institutions. We need patience because it actually takes decades to see some of the fruits of this work. I put there no tolerance for corruption. Well, yes, you should have that within the project as much as you can. Place like Afghanistan, though, you know, you have to live with a level of corruption. And anyway, I would argue there's a lot of corruption in the Western world. It just looks differently. Making yourself redundant is the ultimate mark of success. Learning new opportunities and rules, like how are you going to work with China, how are you going to work with India, how are you going to work with the new rising powers and their offerings. And I'm just going to end then with, there are other types of fund available and have been for some time. I'll just give you one example. This is a Glee Green Climate Fund. And they quote this as a point of difference, I guess, from other types of funds. They say, with close to a 50-50 balance between men and women, 61 nationalities, and many more languages spoken, the Green Climate Fund's diversity reflects the global nature of, and they say the climate challenge, but I would change those words for international development. And I think it's a good model, or the best we can get at the moment, perhaps, for this power rebalance. So thank you for listening, and I'll end it there.